Welcome to another edition of Writing for the Bible Brand. When I say writing for the Bible brand, I'm talking about what does the Bible teach pertaining our conduct, our speech, our basic worldview. I want to begin with, and we're talking about rights. Where do our rights derive from? Where do they come from? And of course we know that they come from God. But I want to begin with this passage in Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 through 27. I want to introduce, by the way, my partner in this, and his bar name is MC Hammer, but he's really named Playing with the Cat. And so he's really good to stand here. He probably wants to get some of this grass before this is over. So let's look at Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 through 27. Here we have an interesting situation in which our Lord is doing the teaching in the temple area. This is the last week of his life. And in come the scribes and Pharisees to overawe him and the crowds part their ways so they can make room for them. And they came in there and they says, "We want to know by what authority you do these things and who gave you this authority." That is, he rode into Jerusalem amidst the hosannas of attendant crowds. He was sitting in the temple area with hundreds and even thousands of people surrounding him, teaching as one of the scholars, and he had not gone to the schools, and they wanted to know, by what authority you do these things, who gave you this authority? He said, "I also will ask you one question, which if you tell me, I will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John," that is, John had baptized, John was now dead. John had baptized in the wilderness. He had immersed for the remission of sins, Mark chapter 1 and verse 4. He said, the baptism of John, whence was it? That is, where did it come from? Where did he get his authority? From heaven or from men? And they reasoned within themselves and they said, well, if we shall say from heaven, that would be from God. Well, he will say to us, why did you not believe him? That is, they had not been baptized of John. And they didn't believe he was from God anyway. And they knew if they said he was from God and he taught baptism from God by God's authority, Jesus would say, why were you not then baptized of him if you're saying he was teaching by God's authority and yet you were not baptized? And they said, but if we shall say from men, we fear the multitude. They all hold John as a prophet. That is, they thought the multitude, according to Luke's gospel, they said that they thought the multitude would stone them if they said that John had no higher authority than himself to preach what he preached and to baptize people. And so they said, we cannot tell. We don't know where he gets his authority. Jesus said, neither tell I you by what authority I do these things. Now I want you to notice this very important fact. And we'll use this passage in future lessons as well. There are only two places from whence a person derives authority to teach anything religiously. Number one, from God, and number two, from man. That's it. There are no other options. If there had been a third option, you know very well they would have thought of it. Now I want to apply that to rights, the concept of rights. I'm asking the question, from whence do you receive your right? That is, who gave you rights? Where do you get your rights to life, liberty, and property? Where do you get those rights? Our founding fathers, with one voice, said it in the Declaration of Independence when they put it this way. They began this way: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve its political connections that have bound them with another. And then they go on to say this in the next paragraph: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then they go on to say that the role of the government is to secure, that is to make sure, protect, that is, these rights. Now that's how the Declaration of Independence reads. Now where do they get their ideas? From the Bible. This is the New Testament, but the Old Testament is where they get it. Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 tells us this, that God said, let us make man in our own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God's the creator, man is the created being. Then he tells them in verse 28 that they are to multiply and replenish the face of the earth. And they are to exercise dominion over it and subdue the land. We'll come back to that in a future lesson, because there are many people today who want to deny and argue with Genesis chapter 1. But be that as it may, that's where the ideas come from that the Founding Fathers wrote right into one of our fundamental documents, the Declaration of Independence, which is listed in the United States Code as one of the fundamental laws of America. Now, having said all of that, the question is this: where do we get our rights? That is, from God. What is the role of government? The role of government is simply to protect what God already gave you. Do you know what the big difference is between New Testament Christians, those who have a God-centered worldview, and those who do not? It is the concept of rights. Many a Democrat has stood up and said that the government grants you rights. No, they don't. No, the government, it does not grant you rights. The role of the government is to protect what you already have from God. Furthermore, you might also note this: a very dangerous doctrine, a very dangerous element has been subjected into the world in the United Nations. The United Nations was established many years ago by people who are basically communists, and such as the Harry Dexter Whites and others. Those people, and in the documents of the United Nations, matter of fact, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it tells us in Article 8 that the government grants rights. That's how it's worded. The rights that the government or the entities of government grant. Do you see the problem here? Oh, yes, you do. Because what a government gives, the government can take away. We preach liberty under God. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 17. And it is God who gives us liberty. He gives us liberty at the same time that He gives us life. Life, liberty, and the ability to own property. All of these God-given rights. That's the difference between a conservative, a biblical conservative, and those who don't have a God-centered worldview, whom I call liberals and totalitarians. That's what I call writing for the Bible brand.